There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn, the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. You will have seen a couple of weeks ago that I had a lovely chat with the Irish novelist Cauvery Madhavan about her novel, The Tainted, which I loved and which I recommend to you highly. I will put a link in the show notes to our chat. And now you are going to be enjoying a general bookish chat with the self-same Irish novelist, Cauvery Madhavan. Welcome back, Cauvery.
Hi, Shawn. Good to be back.
Well, good to be back. And of course, probably everybody knows that this is one continuous chat that we're dividing up into two. But so, Cauvery, what kind of a reader are you?
Well, I literally read everything and anything, Shawn, except for horror. And also, I actually don't read any, psychological crime because I'm actually a real scaredy cat. And if I read any of that kind of stuff, I literally wouldn't be able to sleep, and I'd be sort of imagining things all around the house, and I don't read anything scary. But otherwise, I would read everything.
Okay. Well, you are a much more varied reader than I am, because I am one of those snobs. I only read literary fiction.
Ooh! Well, I'm delighted then that you like my book.
Yes, I have very high standards, Cauvery. So, what are you reading right now?
I have just finished a really fantastic book called Should We Be Left Behind? And it's by a lady called Sharon Dougal.
It's from Blue Moose Press,
Blue
right?
Moose. Yeah, and it's a fantastic book. I really, really loved it. That's the one I just literally finished a few days ago. And now I am reading a non-fiction book called, I can't quite remember the exact name, but it's a history of the Beara Peninsula, which is in the southwest of Ireland. My next book is set there, so I'm in the middle of reading for my next book.
Oh, well, I don't want to press you too much, but what can you tell us about your next book?
Yeah, well, I'd love to tell you about the next book. It's set in the 1980s, but it has a strand running through from 400 years ago that I'm going to weave in through the book. It's fiction from the 1980s with a factual story from the 400 years ago running through it. I'm not quite sure how I would achieve it, but anyway, I'm reading for it. So I'm really looking forward to writing it in the next, I think I'd probably start in about 3 months' time. But at the moment, I'm doing all my reading in that 400-year period, in the 400-year ago period, from the 1600s. So
sounds very exciting.
I hope it'll be a good book. I am very excited about it. It's a bit of history that very much like my previous book, like the Connacht Rangers, is well known in academia, but not very well known outside. And I think it needs to be told.
Are you a one book at a time reader, or are you a book? I call myself a book slut. I don't want to ask you if you are a book slut, but do you?
Oh God, I don't have the ability to read several books at a time. I just can't. So no, I'm a one book at a time person.
You write exclusively or primarily historical fiction?
No, Shawn, not at all. The Tainted was my first book of historical fiction. My previous two books, or literally every book, has been completely different. My first book was very much a contemporary Irish base, set in Ireland. My second book is also set in the 80s, and it's set in Europe. It's about a married couple, in their mid-60s, who come from India for the very first time to Europe, and their son hasn't the time to take them around, so he sticks them on a 16-day coach tour of Europe, and it's what happens to their marriage in those 16 days. So I don't write only historical fiction, and in fact, even though my next book is going to have a strand of history running through it, I wouldn't classify that. Well, I don't know how it's going to turn out. I don't think it'll be historical fiction, but I love history. I love reading in history.
So tell us the title of that book about the Indian couple on a coach tour around Europe.
I have it here, and it's called, can you see it?
The Uncoupling.
The Uncoupling. Yeah.
What a fabulous cover.
Isn't it just?
Oh.
So, the first stop off on their tour is in Amsterdam, and he goes to the red light district with a few of the other people on the coach tour. It's what happens after that.
That's your second novel.
That was my second book, yeah. Yeah.
But can you give us an elevator pitch for your first novel?
Oh, my first book was actually loosely based on our own experience of coming to Ireland, and it's called Paddy Indian.
Great cover too.
Paddy Indian was about a young Indian doctor who comes to Ireland in the 80s, and he falls in love with a fellow doctor, fellow Irish doctor. But it's not a love story. It's what happens between him and his mother because of him falling in love with the Irish girl.
Ah, sounds fabulous. So
Yeah.
I love Indian literature. Can we talk about Indian literature for a little while?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Who
Yeah.
are some Indian authors that you love?
Okay, so my top favorite author and my hero really would be Amitav Ghosh.
Oh, I have never read.
Yeah, well, he's written some really amazing books. If you haven't read him, you should read. One of my favorites is The Glass Palace.
Okay, I've heard of that, and I have
Yeah,
this one
yeah.
on my shelf.
Oh, it's really good, Gun Island. It's a fabulous book. Before he wrote Gun Island, well, many books before he wrote Gun Island, he also wrote another book called The Hungry Tide. That's another fabulous book. But the book that had a huge influence on me was the first book of a trilogy called the Ibis Trilogy. The first book of that is called The Sea of Poppies.
I've heard the title.
Yeah, and The Sea of Poppies really changed me as a writer, as a person, my whole understanding of Indian history. Everything changed when I read The Sea of Poppies, because till then I had only known what was taught to us in school, what history was taught to us in school. Little did I know that that curriculum when I was in school was the same curriculum that the Brits had left us. So the curriculum was very pro-Brit. It's only when I read The Sea of Poppies I realized, my God, there's actually a different, if you're Indian, there's a different way of looking at it. History is completely different. And I mean, he really did change my whole view of history. And more importantly, Shawn, he made me realize how powerful fiction, historical fiction, if it's written with a good deal of research and if you trust the writer, how historical fiction can actually influence people to educate them.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I was totally educated by that book. I began to understand Indian history in a different way, really.
And you certainly employ a lot of that insight into your recent novel, The Tainted.
Yeah, thank you.
Make me want to read Amitav Ghosh.
Yeah, Ghosh, yeah. Another writer I really admire, he's actually Canadian Indian.
Oh, can I guess? Oh, yeah, well, I was going to say Ronan.
You know him already.
I love him so much.
Yeah, me too. I absolutely love his writing. Really, really do. Yeah.
A Fine Balance is maybe one of my favorite novels of all time.
Yeah, me too.
Absolutely heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And just so beautiful. And then last year I read his debut called, it's not his debut. His debut was Short Story Collection, and I haven't read it. And that Short Story Collection is Tales from Firouzabad.
Oh, yes. Yeah. That's actually a fabulous collection of stories. Yeah.
His second book, his first novel, is Such a Long Journey.
And do you know what? I actually haven't read that myself.
It's really good.
I must read it, given that he's one of my favorites. I really should read it.
It's not as good as A Fine Balance, but it's really good.
I think you will love Family Matters. He writes with such compassion. Yeah.
And he hasn't published anything for about 20 years.
Yeah, I wonder, is he working on something at the moment?
I hope so. His last book was published in 2006.
Okay.
Do you know him?
No, not at all. I wish I did.
I want to get a message to him. I want to slip him some money, whatever he needs to write something else.
Yeah. When you head back to Canada.
Yeah, I had a Zoom chat. You might actually be interested in that chat with another booktuber who is from Mumbai. And she was talking for quite a while about how much she loved Rohinton Mystery. And then she almost fell out of her chair when I told her that he's been living in Canada since, I think, the 80s. She didn't know that.
Oh, she didn't know that, yeah. Because, I mean, you wouldn't, if you read his books, you'd think that he was immersed in Bombay, or in Mumbai as it's called now. You'd think that he was living in the heart of it, even today. But I suppose your early childhood and your late teens, your early 20s gets so, it defines your psyche, really. Even if you've left the country, you'd still know it.
I am reading a novel set in India by an Indian-American novelist. It's on the Booker shortlist. Have you read Avni Doshi's Burnt Sugar?
No, I have it on my pile to read, and I'm really looking forward to it.
It's really good. I am about halfway through it. It's just fascinating.
Is that right? I look forward to it. Yeah, I look forward to reading it.
About a very troubled mother-daughter relationship, and the mother has dementia and is forgetting things. So how do you deal with a painful memories from the past with your mother when she doesn't remember?
Yeah. Okay. Look forward to that now. Yeah.
Anybody else that you would cite as favorites? Favorite book or favorite writer?
Yeah, Anita Desai. I love Anita Desai's books, and her daughter Kiran Desai is a fine writer as well. I don't think he's written anything very recently. He's quite well known in India. His name is Upamanyu Chatterjee. Quite a difficult name, and the book that I absolutely love that he wrote, it's called English August.
English August.
Okay. Yeah.
I think I've heard the author's name, but not that book.
Yeah, he's such a fine writer, Shawn. I don't think he's written anything very recently. Now that you've asked me, I will actually go and look up and see if he's written anything recently, and I will definitely buy it. But he's a very fine writer.
Now, if I'm remembering correctly, your hometown, or is it a province? I'm sorry about my ignorance of India. Is it Madras?
Yes. Yeah, it's a town. It's a city.
It's a city.
It's a city, yeah.
Any Madras writers that you can recommend?
Madras writers. Yeah, a young writer from Madras who's really made big waves all over is a woman called Tishani Doshi. She's a poet as well. She's a very fine writer.
Small Days and Nights?
That's it. That's the one. Yeah, a young Indian writer. And her husband is Italian, and his name is Carlo Piazzati.
Wow.
And he's also a writer and has written some really fantastic books as well.
Oh, fascinating. And I see here, Wikipedia tells me, I did not have this information in my head, that her mother is Welsh.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Welsh mother and a Gujarati father, but lives just outside Madras in a small fishing village. They're both fine writers, and he writes about autobiographical stuff. He's got a really good sense of humor, and I think he writes a good bit in Italian as well. So he has several books. She is a poet, and she's a dancer. Very talented.
Yeah. What else have I read from India?
I'm sure you have read Arundhati Roy. I loved her first book. I've read several of her essays, and I admire her for her passion for all the activism that she's involved in. It's a dangerous place to be. Be an activist in India is quite a dangerous thing, and I really admire her for it.
My strongest connection to Arundhati Roy is her second novel, which is called The Ministry of Utmost Happiness.
The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I did that as an audio text combo. Do you have any idea what I'm talking about? Audio combo?
No, not at all.
I did it on audio as an audiobook. But not only audiobook. I had the book open in front of me for the entire time that I was listening. So, and it was narrated.
Wow.
It was narrated by Arundhati Roy. And
oh my gosh, okay.
The pronunciation and there were
songs.
You probably remember there were songs in it, and she would sing the songs, and it was like having Arundhati Roy in my brain.
Yeah, wow, I've never thought of doing that. I must try it for some other book, maybe.
I have to say, for me, it's the peak way to experience a fictional text.
Okay, right, well, go with your suggestion.
Now, I wasn't a huge fan of the novel. I didn't think it quite worked, but it's brilliant regardless.
Yeah.
It left a marvelous aftertaste. But yeah, the first time I ever did that was with Wolf Hall. I had the book, and I just sank so deeply into that. You have to find an audiobook where the narrator adds something. Or it doesn't work. But any last thoughts on Indian literature?
I decided at the start of this year, and I actually did it. I half did it, if I have to confess. I decided to read a lot of Indian writers in translation. Regional Indian writers who are just amazing, absolutely amazing Indian writing in regional language. And I decided, okay, I'm going to actually make a concerted effort to read them in translation. So I was in India at the start of the year before the pandemic, and I must have bought about 20 books in translation into English, regional writers. I have to confess, I actually haven't started any of them, but I really look forward. That's going to be my project for the next few months. I'm going to read every alternate book I read. I'm going to read one Indian regional writer in translation.
That's wonderful.
The regional Indian writing is such a long tradition. People outside India don't know. Tamil, writers in Bengali, writers in Gujarati, they're all just amazing.
I want to tell you about one, you probably have heard of it, but that I read and it was in translation. The writer is Gogu Shyamala, and it's a collection of short stories with one of the best titles ever to be put on a book. Father may be an elephant and mother only a small basket, but ...
Oh, I have to get hold of that. I looked that up.
It was awesome.
If you go to India, to the bookshops in India, you will just be so blown away, Shawn. An ordinary sized bookshop in India will just do off any big bookshop anywhere else in the world. People are just reading voraciously in India. Fantastic.
So your adopted home is Ireland. Are you a big reader of Irish writers?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. When I came to Ireland, I discovered William Trevor.
Oh,
I absolutely love William Trevor. He would be my Irish idol. Him and John McGahan, I think. And very recently now, very recently, I discovered Donal Ryan. And if you haven't read his latest book, Strange Flowers, it's just really superb.
I have not. I will
Yeah,
take your advisement. Thank you.
Like John McGahan, he really gets into the rural psyche of Ireland, and his language is so simple and it's very colloquial. And definitely, if you're Irish, if you start reading it, you will immediately know your place. You'll know the place in the book. You'll know the people instantly. He is such an absolutely amazing writer.
I think we might have a friend in common, Ronan Hessian. Have you read his book?
Oh my God, Ronan's book was I actually hadn't read any fiction for maybe 5 years because I was so immersed in reading nonfiction for The Tainted that I found it very hard. I was picking up books and just putting them down because I just couldn't get my head around. I don't know what it was. I had gotten so used to reading nonfiction and reading history. At the start of this year, I picked up Ronan's book and I loved it. I totally credit Leonard and Hungry Paul for getting me back into reading.
So many people have said that exact same thing.
Yeah, really. It was such a gentle book, as I described it on Twitter, it's an extraordinary book about very ordinary people. I credit that book for taking me back into reading fiction, and now I can't stop.
Fantastic. And he's got a new one coming out early next year. I'm very excited. I might be getting a proof of that.
Oh, you lucky man.
I'm sure he would give you one too. If he'd give me one, he'd give you one.
Well, we'll see.
In terms of fiction, do you read only new stuff, or do you like to go back into the backlist and into more, books written 20, 30, 50 years ago?
That's a really interesting question because I wouldn't read only new stuff. I'd have my guilty list of books that I haven't read, which I know I should have read. But I'm also now looking at rereading books that I loved.
Why?
And it's to do with starting a new book, as I am on the cusp of starting a new book. And I think along with the research for the book, you want to immerse yourself in good writing. I just feel like there are a couple of books I want to reread, and I'll tell you two of them. One is The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. I'm going to reread that because I just loved it. I loved the expansiveness, the social commentary in the book, and I just loved it. The other one that I want to read again is Jeffrey Eugenides' Middlesex.
I've read that one as well.
The amount of history in it, and the way it was seamlessly woven into the book. You never felt that you were being overloaded with history, and yet you learned so much as you went on. So I think those two books I'm definitely going to give a reread before I start my own fourth book. There's something
Oh, sorry.
inspiring in reading a well-written book. It's nearly telling us, this is the way I should be writing. This is the standard to which I want to write. It's something that just struck me a few months ago. Apart from doing my own research, I'm actually going to reread those two books.
Do you have any worries that you might not like them as well years later?
No, I haven't thought of that.
Sometimes some of my favorites, I don't want to reread them because I'm worried I might not like them as well. And I just want to get that first experience. My favorite novel, I wonder if you might have read it. It certainly is similarly preoccupied with history down through the generations, is by a Asian Canadian novelist, Madeleine Tien. Do Not Say We Have Nothing.
No, I haven't read that.
It was
I must.
It was published about 4 or 5 years ago, and it goes back to the Cultural Revolution and traces a group of musicians and their families up to the present. It's heartbreaking and beautiful. It's a bit of a Marmite book. People either love it or hate it, but for me, it's the best book I've ever read, and I think you might like it.
Something about what you've said reminds me of the book, The Buddha in the Attic.
Julia Otsuka, about Japanese picture brides immigrating to America.
That's right. It's such a fantastic book. And it's not just the story, but her technique, the actual technique is so wonderful. That's another lovely book. Really love that book very much.
Put that on my list. So you talked, Cauvery, about how when you're deep into research for a novel, you don't read as much fiction, or it's a bit of a challenge to read fiction. When you're actually writing your novels, does that affect your reading during the writing process? Can you talk a bit about that?
It's strange, actually. I do very little reading when I'm writing. When I'm writing, I tend to do a lot of visual research. Say, for example, now my next book is set in the 80s in Ireland and in the 1600s in Ireland. So I'm actually now going to have this absolutely fantastic time watching every movie that was ever made in the Elizabethan times and in the 80s in Ireland, 80s up to the 90s, even going back to the 70s in Ireland. And that's such fun. I do find once I start writing, I prefer to have visual references rather than written references. I like to do a lot of my research and then leave it, to kind of stew in my head. But when I'm writing, I prefer to have visuals. So I'd watch TV programs or, documentaries. It's all visual for me.
Wonderful. I am famous. I'm not very famous, but what people that know me, I am famous for being a bailer.
Oh, what's that?
If I don't like a book, I will just stop reading.
Oh, right. Okay.
I used to call myself the queen of bailing, but I have promoted myself. I'm now the empress of bailing. So do you ever bail on books, Cauvery?
Very rarely. Very, very rarely. I would actually see a book through and form my opinion at the end. I actually can't remember one book that I haven't
finished,
except,
is this the part of the interview where Cauvery spills the dirt on a book she didn't like? I'm here for this.
The life of me, I cannot remember the name. One of Salman Rushdie's books. The one that he wrote immediately after Midnight's Children.
Okay, well, we'll find it here.
I think I made 3 attempts at 3 different stages of my life, like not one attempt after the other, but, with good, big, long gaps.
Well, that is an honest try.
Yeah, and I just couldn't get into it at all.
You said it was the one after Satanic?
Yeah, because I would have been quite young, and I remember being disappointed in myself that I couldn't,
The Moor's Last Sigh?
Yes, that's the word, The Moor's Last Sigh. I remember actually feeling a bit stupid. I actually kind of blamed myself the first time that I was just maybe too dense. And then I gave it another go, and then I just left it.
I have not read any Salman Rushdie. I have Midnight's Children on my shelf, and I'm going to start with that.
It's a fabulous book. Fabulous book.
To Vancouver when I was living there about 15 years ago, and so I have an autographed copy of Shalimar the Clown.
Yeah, Shalimar the Clown. I haven't read that, but I know of the book, yeah.
And I heard mostly negative reviews about Quixote, his most recent one. I'm suddenly hearing very, very positive reviews.
With Salman Rushdie, I think that leap of faith that you have to take when you're reading magical realism. And I mean, if you're willing to do that, I think the book will transport you into a different world and you'll enjoy the book. But I think if you're not, I think that's what it is. I mean, it's interesting because, you were asking me, just to come back, I cannot not say this now. One of my big literary heroes, and I cannot believe I didn't say this to you earlier, is V.S. Naipaul.
Ah.
I just love his writing. And one of the books that had a huge influence on me was a book that was written by Paul Theroux about his relationship with V.S. Naipaul. And it's called In Sir Vidyas Shadow.
Because they had a massive falling out, right?
Yeah. But this book, In Sir Vidyas Shadow, is such an amazing book about a literary friendship that fell apart. And even though it's about their friendship falling apart, it was really like an ode to V.S. Naipaul by Paul Theroux. It's such a fabulous book. And that book actually had a huge influence on me as well, because I was just starting to write Paddy Indian at that time. I had the opportunity to see V.S. Naipaul and Salman Rushdie in Dublin. And the difference, V.S. Naipaul was my hero until the day I saw him on stage. Being such a nasty piece of, I can't tell you, he was just so arrogant and so horrible. I mean, my world fell apart when I watched that interview. And I remember being so disappointed and wishing that I'd never gone to see the interview. But the exact opposite with Salman Rushdie, because Salman Rushdie's books are fairly highbrow and so literary, and you'd expect the man to be an absolute snob. But when he was on stage, I've actually seen him in live interviews several times, 2 or 3 times. And every time he's just so friendly, funny, totally accessible, everything as far away from highbrow as you could think of. I think you then appreciate his books, his writing so much more because he's a nice guy.
I have not read anything by him, but I've had this on my shelf for a couple of years and I'm dying to get to it. Look at that cover.
Oh my God, you will love it. You will absolutely love it.
I think it's the most beautiful cover I've ever seen.
That's obviously a new edition because I've never seen it with that cover before. But it is a fabulous book. You will love it. You'll absolutely love it.
I can't wait.
And there's another one, The Bend in the River, that's fantastic as well.
Speaking of the memoir that Paul Theroux wrote about him, the anecdote, correct me if I'm misremembering it, but the anecdote that I've always remembered is Paul Theroux, after he and Naipaul had this huge falling out, he was browsing in a used bookstore and he found his books that had been personally inscribed as a gift to V.S. Naipaul. Naipaul had sold them.
So I think there was a reconciliation at the Jaipur Literary Festival many, many, many years later, just before V.S. Naipaul died. I think he kind of made a public apology. He publicly said that he regretted the falling out. But I would urge you, once you finish reading The House for Mr. Biswas, please read Theroux's book, In Sir Vidyas Shadow. You will love it, Shawn. With your kind of literary background, you will absolutely love it. It's such a fantastic book.
Fabulous. And so now this is the part of the interview where I ask you to tell me about your literary feuds.
Oh, I've had none. I'm only just starting out and I hope I never have a feud with anybody.
That was a joke question, but I will leave it in. I have one question about nonfiction. I have been looking for an accessible introductory history of India because I love Indian literature, but I know that I'm missing certain historical nuances because I just don't know the history. I tackled a huge history. It was like a 700 or 800 page history of India, and it was just too much for me. Can you recommend anything?
It's not a history of all of India, but it's a fantastic book. It's called Anarchy, and it's by William Dalrymple.
I've heard of that one, yes.
Yeah, and I think it'll give you a really good flavor of British India. And then if you want a really academic historians, I would recommend Ramchand Guha.
Okay.
Guha Guha. He's a really well-known historian, and he writes about India. And he's written about every period. But I think you will really love Anarchy.
You just told me how devastated, I think maybe not too strong of a word, you were to have your image of V.S. Naipaul crushed when you saw him in person.
Yeah.
So in closing, I would just like to say that I've had the exact opposite experience meeting you, Cauvery Madhavan.
Thank you, Shawn.
I hope that I can have you back someday to talk about your next novel or to talk about some other books. I would love to have you come back.
Yeah, fantastic. I'd love to as well. And it was great talking to you. I kind of forgot that we were on a Zoom call. I just feel that we were just chatting, So
it's been a complete delight. Thank you.
Thanks, Shawn.